Well, this is really an historic win for Pacific Island countries. They have been calling for decades for wealthy nations to, for the key principle is that polluters should pay for the loss and damage that their emissions cause for communities in the Pacific. And really, this has been a decision that has been coming for 30 years. So this COP27 decision to establish a loss and damage fund is a historic moment.
Yeah. What do you think the politics were? I mean, we know that the Pacific nations have suffered so much. We saw floods in Pakistan unseen before. Do you think it's collective incidents that have pointed to the need for this fund?
Absolutely. You know, the world has warmed approximately 1.2 degrees since the pre-industrial average, and we are seeing the impacts of that around the globe with, you know, here in Australia, we've seen the costliest flood disasters that we have ever seen this year. Obviously in Pakistan, you know, more than 30 million people were directly impacted by unprecedented flooding. And so that, I think, really has shifted the politics, the realization that loss and damage are being experienced now. The impacts of climate change are not in the distant future. They are being felt by communities the world over right now, and they're hitting the most vulnerable first. And these are communities that have done the least to contribute to the problem. And that realization, I think, is why we have seen the establishment of this fund to address the loss and damage caused by climate change.
Yeah, that imbalance. Now, I mean, they've agreed on it, but do we have a sense of how this is going to actually work?
Well, we don't yet. So, you know, it has been a historic breakthrough that wealthy nations will pay for loss and damage caused by climate change, but exactly how it will be paid for is yet to be ironed out. So there is scope for developed countries to move first, but an expectation that the multilateral banks will contribute. And what was really interesting at these talks is the expectation that countries like China will also contribute to paying for loss and damage caused by their emissions. So that was a real shift and a real push from countries like the United States and the European Union.
But do we think China will pay up? I mean, they keep arguing that they should be an exceptional case as a developing nation, but given the size of its economy and, as you point out, the size of their emissions, is that something that they should be part of?
Well, that is a live question. I mean, when the United Nations climate talks began 3 decades ago, China was a much poorer nation, but today China is the world's biggest emitter. And with more power comes an expectation that China will take more responsibility. So the way that the decision that they arrived at, it will leaves room for the industrial nations that have been emitting for centuries to go first, but there is an expectation and there is room for countries like China to also contribute. So I think that will be a fight at next year's UN climate talks.
Yeah. We seem to have these fights, we have these wins. Often we don't see much headway, and you know, you talked about 1.2 degrees, but there's no more headway that we're making with regard to that 1.5 degrees being the limit of warming.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, 1.5 degrees is considered to be a really important threshold, particularly for small island states. It's considered to be a threshold for the survival of low-lying Pacific Island countries. And the UN is really, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is really clear on this, that if we are to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we need global emissions to be halved this decade. And we're not there yet. You know, we've seen new commitments from many nations, particularly at last year's UN climate talks, but to see countries, including Australia, setting stronger 2030 targets if we are to limit warming to 1.5 degrees.
How much is the Ukraine war driving this push to really do a transition in terms of energy that may then support those targets?
Yeah, well, the war in Ukraine has really revealed the folly of being dependent on fossil fuels. And particularly in Europe, we've seen countries, uh, they've had this realization that they are inordinately dependent on Russian gas to keep houses warm in winter. And Europe has responded by making plans to move faster to renewable energy and faster, not just away from Russian gas, but away from gas full stop. So the war in Ukraine, the International Energy Agency is really clear on this, that the war on Ukraine will hasten the global shift to renewable energy and away from fossil fuels.
Australia is making quite a serious bid to co-host COP in 2026, along with the Pacific. How important a move would that be, and what would it mean for Australia to be part of that?
Oh, it would be a really big deal. Hosting the UN climate talks would be the biggest diplomatic event that Australia has ever hosted. At the UN climate talks in Egypt at the moment, there are over 40,000 people attending. So if Australia was to host, I'd imagine it would be in somewhere like Sydney or Melbourne. And it would be really important for Australia's domestic climate policy, but also for resetting our relations with Pacific Island countries. Because if we were to take on that responsibility, there would be an expectation that Australia comes to the table with more ambitious policy for deep cuts to emissions this decade, but also with a real plan as a responsible middle power to broker global cooperations for deeper emissions cut. And that's what Pacific nations need to see to ensure their survival. So it would be a really big deal for Australia to host the UN climate talks.
We'll watch and see how it unfolds. Great to have you on, Wes. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me.